My name is Rudy Shankar, and you are the Energy Systems Engineering seminar series, and we have the seventh in the series this past spring. And all the taught papers are
Okay, I think something happened with Professor Shankar.
Yeah, I can't hear either.
No, I think he's actually gone. He had a warning. Oh,
It'll be back.
Okay.
yeah, it was an automatic system reboot, everybody. So he will be back in like 2 minutes.
Okay,
Just
great.
waiting for for the system. I warned him. He said that message popped up, and I said I think you should take care of that before the thing starts. And then we got into talking with you to make sure everything was all.
Right.
So if everybody could be patient, we will start shortly.
Okay. Yeah, hopefully I won't have any trouble getting out of share screen at the end. Um, but
Yeah,
if I
no,
do,
normally I think you just click on the share and I think it asks to disable it or whatever, or stop sharing.
yeah, no, I should be able to do that. But since it's been acting a little peculiar this morning, if I can, I could just sign off and sign right back in.
This is Jim Robinson, one of the participants. Actually, I believe your first slide is showing on our screen right now. I think you're probably ready to go.
Okay, let's
Yeah,
hope
well,
so.
once Rudy rejoins us, glad to have you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's great to be able to speak to you. You would think after all this time, we would have all the kinks worked out on the
I
technical
know, right?
side, but it's still, and then half the time I forget to unmute.
It's all these little things the 100 things you have to keep on
Right.
top of mind. I feel like I should be playing Jeopardy's music.
I can run a few minutes late if we need to. I don't know
Okay,
if
sounds
that's
good.
okay from your point of view, but I don't have a hard stop. Maybe I can blur my background.
Hey. Sorry about this, everybody. Please hold.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Apologize, guys. My computer decided to reboot. I'll make the introduction of Dan Farber. Dan is going to be talking about toward a future-facing climate policy. He's a Sato Professor of Law at the University of California in Berkeley. He also has leadership roles at two Berkeley research centers, the Center for Law, Energy and Environment, and the Edley Center on Law and Democracy. Professor Farber is a member of the American Academy of Arts and is a graduate of the University of Illinois, where he earned his BA, MA, and JD degrees. He graduated summa cum laude from the College of Law. Dr. Farber has been a guest visiting professor at Stanford Law School, Harvard Law School, and the University of Chicago Law School. He graduated in University of Illinois in 1971. He got his MA in the University of Illinois BA and MA, University of Illinois, and he got his JD in the University of Illinois also. And again, welcome Dan, and sorry for the rough introduction.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you all today. And hopefully, we had a few technical glitches in the setup, but hopefully everything will go smoothly from here on out. So the original slide title for this talk was inspired by a sign I saw while I was on an airport moving walkway that said, "Please face in the direction you are traveling." And that seemed like good advice to me. We're traveling toward the future, so it seems to me our focus should be there, not just on what we're leaving behind. But I think a maybe more concrete title is the one on this slide, Climate Policy for the Energy Transition. So my basic argument is for recentering the way at least environmental lawyers and regulators have traditionally thought about environmental issues, which has been about incentivizing polluters to clean up. So we make them get permits, we give them fines if they don't reduce their emissions and so forth. But I think in the context of the energy transition, that's too narrow. Because we have to really think about building the new energy system just as much as how we're going to leave the old fossil fuel system behind. And we need a holistic vision that includes both disincentives for carbon emissions along with incentives for clean technologies. And as I'll argue, the goal should be a cycle of innovation, lower costs, and greater build out. I'll argue that the Biden spending trilogy, the three big spending bills relating to energy and climate, or at least partly relating to energy and climate, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, are a promising model. And I'll argue that there are some important advantages to using spending as a tool as opposed to regulation. But my point is really larger. Spending is just one tool for green industrial policy, but the real issue is how do we remake our energy sector using whatever tools are available. So I want to talk a little bit about the spending trilogy. There's a lot of money and they're very complicated laws, and I'm not going to go into great detail. In fact, I'm not even going to go into as much detail as the slides do, just to keep us moving forward this morning. So the Inflation Reduction Act is really the sort of centerpiece and climax of this series of laws.
Daniel, I'm sorry, are you advancing your slide?
Yes. Can you?
Okay, we don't see that here.
Yeah,
That,
they are not advancing on our side.
okay. Okay. So I don't know quite what to do. Why don't I stop the share and see if I can now restart it. And let me change the way the slides are set up maybe quickly. Okay, so let's try this and see if that's going to work any better. Back to Zoom. All right, so now let's try sharing the slides again. Okay, now are you seeing?
I'm seeing yes, it doesn't, you're able to move it.
Okay, so
Yeah,
let's
if you need to leave it that way in PowerPoint, that's fine. Whatever
yeah,
works.
let me do that just to avoid having to spend more time fooling around with the setup. Okay, so let me just run through these slides very quickly again, but I won't go through everything. My basic point is about thinking in terms of the energy transition rather than just how do we reduce carbon emissions. They're intimately related, but I think the energy transition is a broader framing of the issues and one that's important because it focuses our attention equally on how we're going to build the new energy system. Whereas if we just think about reducing emissions, we're more focused on the disentangling ourselves from the old system. And I'm going to talk about three major spending bills as models for how this could work. So you should be seeing a slide that says what's in the IRA.
Yes, we
Yeah,
see
okay.
that.
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm not going to go through all of this stuff one by one, but what you can see is a total of about 370 billion in climate funding, assuming that it remains intact, of course, um, and potentially a lot more because the first entry says 260 billion in clean energy tax credits, but that's probably conservative. Later estimates were that it could easily be twice as big because the tax credits are not capped. So it really just depends on how many firms decide to take advantage of them. The Inflation Reduction Act was the sort of headline bill, but there were two other important spending bills. The bipartisan infrastructure law, um, which was passed before the other two, a lot of it is about highways and bridges and sort of traditional infrastructure. Uh, but there's quite a bit in the bill, in the what about 100+ billion for rail, for modernizing public transit, for uh, safety improvements to get people out of cars and walking and biking, um, and 7.5 billion for charging stations and 6 billion for energy storage. The CHIPS Act, CHIPS is an acronym, and I don't know that anyone remembers what it actually stands for, but it's quite descriptive because most of the law is about semiconductors and trying to create a domestic semiconductor industry and promote innovation on that side of things and on AI. But there are also billions of dollars for energy research and development, including clean energy technologies, hydrogen, nuclear, carbon removal, and building efficiency. So altogether, I think these laws are putting somewhere in the neighborhood of, I don't know, four to five $100 billion into the clean technology sector. And one of the things I think is notable is the sort of broad swath of these laws. They're not just focused on, say, decarbonizing the power sector, which has been probably the lead focus on the regulatory side. There's a lot of money going into cleaning up the power sector, but there's also a lot of money, about a quarter of the funding goes for transportation-related emissions. There's funding to try to start bringing down industrial emissions. As you probably know, trying to get rid of emissions from steel and cement and other industries is going to be the next big challenge, and it's one where the technology is probably not quite there yet. So this is an effort to get things moving there. Stuff on trying to create carbon sinks and reduce carbon emissions from land use changes. Methane, a very powerful but shorter term greenhouse gas, and emissions from buildings. So what we really see here is a sort of economy-wide effort that's trying to address issues, in all sectors, not just the ones that have gotten the most notice, or the ones where we've started to make the most progress. So as this slide says, I think one of the things that's really notable about these laws is their horizontal scope. They cover just about all sectors and carbon sources, everything from electricity and transport to ag and heavy industry, not just funding for EVs, which is the primary technology we're counting on for decarbonizing, but also for charging stations, public transit, ferries, buses, et cetera. And there's also what you might call a vertical scope in terms of thinking about, for each sector, what needs to happen, and really trying to address the issues all the way from initial research to development and maintaining startups through the so-called Valley of Death, to get technologies to market, as well as trying to figure out how to build out technologies and give incentives for those. So I think that, added together, these laws cover really just about all the little pieces that need to happen in order to have a successful energy transition. They don't necessarily suffice. I don't think anyone thought at the time that they did, but they could be a big step forward. And this chart shows the results of modeling about what kind of effect the Inflation Reduction Act will have, or would have at least, if fully implemented, on emissions by 2030. The blue line or black line to the left, on the left side of the graph, are historic emissions up to the time that the statute was passed, and then the dotted lines show various modeling projections. The blue dotted lines show what happens under what was current policy, that is pre-IRA policy. And you can see there's a range. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty in trying to model what the energy system's going to do in the future. And then the orange dotted lines and that orange bar show what happens with the Inflation Reduction Act. And what you can see is that we're roughly doubling the amount of reductions, or coming close to doubling the amount of reductions that we would have gotten without the IRA. So that, potentially up to a 40% reduction from 2005 levels. Again, this is something you may well know about, but you'll notice that actually we've been reducing emissions since 2005. And so our task at this point isn't to, unlike China, we don't have to worry about peaking. Our task is to maintain progress and hopefully accelerate it. And the IRA would have, or will, maybe, as we'll have to see, actually somewhat accelerate the progress that we were previously making. So significant impact on emissions projected. Okay, so with that as background, I want to talk about and spend a little more time on the economic and regulatory dynamics of industrial policy. How do we actually plan to make changes and grow the clean energy sector? Uh, which obviously depends on a lot of things, but which policy is one lever for trying to do that. So there's a potential cycle here that can lead to accelerated changes um, within a sector, um, a cycle where government policy drives industry expansion, innovation, and cost cutting. And then the result of the innovation and cost cutting is that the sector expands some more, and this can become a sort of self-sustaining dynamic. It's what some people call a virtuous cycle as opposed to a vicious cycle in which bad things just reinforce each other. In this case, good things can reinforce each other. Economists talk about learning by doing, and it can be a powerful force for growing new industries. And what industrial policy is about is trying to launch that process in chosen sectors of the economy. That can be risky. You can make the wrong bets on what sectors are going to grow, um, or it can be exploited by special interest groups. So industrial policy is not an excuse for doing whatever we want in whatever sector of the economy we want. But I think that as a number of economists have argued, this is a promising area in which the government could helpfully intervene to accelerate change. And in fact, even in the early days of the growth of the renewable energy system, government policy had an effect. Um, uh, Policy in Germany and in California promoting solar energy was very important in helping to create a market for solar, which then allowed the industry to start bringing prices down and innovating, and then made it possible to expand further. So I want to sort of illustrate what's been going on in these sectors with a couple of graphs. This is an estimate of the levelized cost of energy. So levelized cost, which you're probably familiar with, is just the idea that you um, have to amortize the capital cost of the technology along with the operating costs in order to figure out what it's actually costing you to produce a kilowatt hour of electricity. And what you can see here is, first of all, if we look at sort of the previous dominant technologies, coal has not really made any progress in terms of levelized cost. If anything, it's possibly gone up a little bit due to increased pollution control requirements. Natural gas has continued to decline, and if this chart went back further, I think you'd see even more dramatic declines as we sort of see the beginning of the fracking revolution in natural gas. But even, since 2011 to 2020, over that whole decade, we see continuing declines. Nuclear just seems to get more expensive, unfortunately, as safety retrofits become necessary and older plants just need updating. But what's really, I think, eye-catching is what's happened to the levelized cost of wind and solar on this chart. What you can see is that, so both of those at the beginning of the chart were significantly more expensive than coal and a lot more expensive than natural gas. And what we see is rapid cost declines for both, and particularly rapid declines for solar, so that instead of being like twice as expensive or more as natural gas at the beginning, the levelized costs are actually considerably lower than natural gas by 2020. So when I'm talking to students about, my students are often kind of despair about whether we can do anything about climate change. And this is one of the things I point to as a hopeful development, because this means that trying to deal with climate change has gone from an extremely heavy burden to something a lot more affordable. Now, it's not necessarily going to, this is a facility-based estimate. So if you figure in the need for potentially more battery storage or more transmission, and look at the system-wide issue, it's still going to cost us money, but it's not going to be the potentially crushing economic burden that people initially were afraid it would be. Battery storage costs have seen even more dramatic reductions, if anything. Uh, um, so this, as you can see, storage, this is what, a kilowatt hour. So it's gone down from about $1,200 per kilowatt hour to about $115 per kilowatt hour. This is a 90% price decline over the course of a little, essentially a decade, a little more than a decade. And we expect further price declines, although, we're not going to see the 90% reductions, I don't think, that at least not in a very rapid way. But there's still more room to go because battery technologies are still evolving pretty quickly. So that's certainly an area where we could expect a little policy push to help with adoption, and innovation in the area could have a big effect. And as you would expect, prices go down, demand goes up. And so you can see here the increase in actual production in these different sectors. So, we see wind growing very rapidly um, and sort of consistently across a long period of time. We see storage, which has a kind of exponential growth curve, and solar, which has a less pronounced but also accelerating growth curve in terms of actual power production. So the question is, this can't go on forever. For one thing, you can't get over 100%. So we can expect at some point all this is going to level off, or at least as a percentage of system need. But the question is, how long can we sustain this sort of very rapid growth in order to transform the sector? That's, I think, the issue. And some of this growth will happen, I think, willy-nilly, because it's just driven by existing economic trends. But I think some of it, can benefit considerably from policy. Now, when I've talked about these ideas, a lot of people, at least in my field, think that I'm actually opposing regulation of uh, the energy sector, limits on emissions of CO2, for example, from power plants. And that's not true. I think there are two ways to get where we want to go. We could push down on the fossil fuel side and boost the clean energy side. And I think ultimately we're going to need to do both of those. But I think the part about pushing down on the um, existing fossil fuel system becomes a lot easier the cheaper it is to replace that energy use with clean energy, right? Because uh, regulatory agencies do a lot cost benefit analysis. They try to figure out how much it's going to cost to get emissions and what the benefits are. The statutes require them to take cost into account, although they're less specific about how. So the cheaper you can make the emission cuts, the stricter the regulation can be. And under Biden, we also saw some of this effect. The Biden administration required existing coal-fired power plants to implement carbon capture and sequestration. This was supposed to be over, or well, I'm kind of doubtful the regulations will actually be implemented given the political change, but the idea was over, roughly 10-year period, we would be expecting coal-fired power plants to adopt this technology. And one of the arguments that EPA made was that the tax credit was going to make it a lot more economically feasible for power plants to adopt the technology. People tend to focus on federal level regulation and federal level climate policy, but that's actually a little nearsighted because in the US, state governments have actually been not every state, obviously, but maybe half the states have been working to varying degrees on reducing emissions, and that has tended to be a much more stable policy trajectory than we see at the federal level. So what we see at the state level is, let's say California, which is sort of the poster child, has pretty consistently maintained and strengthened its climate change regulations over time. Just like the federal government, the state governments have to think about regulatory cost. Maybe even more so because they have to worry about competing for industry. So the cheaper you can make the replacement technologies for states, the more states are able to do in the way of policies reducing emissions from fossil fuels, right? And this again kind of adds to the feedback cycle, because the tighter regulations on fossil fuels then discourage investment in that industry, lead to further expansion on the clean tech side, which again makes it more profitable to innovate, right? If you have a very small industry, you're not going to make a lot of money very quickly if you come out with a better version of the product or a cheaper version. Whereas if you've got a very large industry, you've got a ready-made market for innovation that gives you a greater economic incentive for innovating. So expanding the market size is one way of fostering innovation. Innovation then can feed back by lowering costs and leading to even further expansion of the market, right? So if everything works out the way we would like, what we see is a cycle in which the energy transition becomes kind of self-sustaining as it generates economic dynamics that move things in the right direction. Okay, so one thing I think is, engineers tend to think about the sort of, technical feasibility or economic feasibility of technologies. The regulators and lawyers think about what does the law say and what does the cost benefit analysis do? How are we going to go? And if you look at what economists say about climate policy, it's almost all about that. Like, what if we want to get to X% emissions reduction? What's the best policy for doing that? And what they consistently tell us is that it's a carbon tax with additional funding for supporting basic research in energy technologies. And of course, the only problem with the carbon tax, at least according to many people, is it's just not politically possible. And I think what that highlights is the need to really think about politics when we're designing policies and thinking about the best policies. One reason is that we want industry, private investors to make collectively huge investments in new infrastructure. And it doesn't make any sense to do that without some assurance about what the future is going to look like, whether the current regulatory scheme will stay in effect, right? And that's something people are talking about today. If we want to encourage a huge amount of investment in manufacturing in the US by the use of tariffs, people won't do that if they think the tariffs could disappear, in some, year or two period of time. They need some assurance that they're going to continue to have market protection. And it's the same thing with the kinds of incentives we're trying to do for the energy transition. And unfortunately, the kind of regulation we see from EPA at the federal level has not had that kind of stability. And it's almost too obvious to point out, but I will anyway. If you look from Bush, basically um, um, was a supporter of fossil fuels, was resistant to doing anything to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Then with Obama, we began some significant regulations in power plants and transportation. They went to Trump. He undid what Obama had done. Then we get Biden, who seeks even stronger regulation. And then we get to Trump, who again is trying to do everything that his predecessor did. So it's kind of hard to know in terms of making investments what the EPA regulatory scheme is going to look like 5, 10 years down the road, right? If I had to bet, I would say it's going to look more like Biden than like Trump, but I might just be projecting my own, what I would like to see happen. It's just very hard to know. One advantage of subsidies over regulation. So why does this happen? Because the regulation costs firms money. And for that reason, you have a group of, just like taxes, right? So you have a group of people who have a very vivid economic stake in trying to undo current policy because they don't want to have the regulatory costs and they don't want to pay the taxes. In contrast, subsidies tend to stick because they create strong constituencies, right? You now have a group of people who have a very direct economic stake in continuing the policy. Now, this is not always necessarily a good thing, right? So agricultural subsidies began during the Depression era, but they've proved really impossible to eliminate over time, even though, or to, really radically change because um, of the farm lobby, which now has a huge stake. Farmers have, um, it's not just that they want to keep making money in the future. Land prices have been set on the basis of these policies. Farmers need to pay their mortgages and so on. Um, we also see some of that sticking effect, maybe a little closer to the topic, with uh, what amount to subsidies for corn ethanol, which a lot of climate experts are dubious about. Some see moderate reductions in emissions with corn ethanol. Others think corn ethanol could actually end up increasing emissions. But there's now so many people making so much money from those policies, very difficult to undo, right? So bad policies stick, but good policies also stick better if you use subsidies, or tax credits are equivalent to subsidies for these purposes. And we need policy stability to incentivize the kind of investments we need, as I've been saying. So the question is, are we going to get it? The short answer is, well, who knows? But let me say a little bit more about why I think it's a real possibility that those Biden era subsidies, or at least many of them, will stick. As you know, Trump wants to wipe out all clean energy policies, basically, including the IRA. And Republicans are looking for ways to offset deficits from their projected tax cuts and increases in immigration and defense spending. Since since no Republican voted for the IRA, that makes it kind of an attractive target. But it's not so easy to get rid of. And that's the point. They could all agree about getting rid of EPA regulations, but getting rid of the IRA entirely has proved much trickier. And the reason is illustrated by this chart, or the map and chart, right? So there have been a lot of new projects announced or begun. There has been something like $90 billion in additional investment, some of which has actually, been expended, some of which is in the pipeline. And what you can see, this chart shows manufacturing for automobile plants, battery manufacturing plants, solar production. And these are the new investments. And one thing that's pretty obvious is they're not just clustered in the sort of blue states on the East Coast and the West Coast, right? They're really spread across the country, and there are a ton of them south of the Mason-Dixon line or in sort of the Midwest swing states like Michigan, which means that a lot of the beneficiaries of these projects are people who live in Republican congressional districts. And in some ways, the chart underestimates that, because even in blue states like California, many of the actual investments are in rural areas, which are represented by Republicans in Congress, right? Nobody would build a big new car manufacturing plant in San Francisco, even if you could get all the permitting and stuff done. The price of land would just be crazy. The bar graph at the bottom of the slide shows the states getting the most investment, and so the top 4 states are North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, Michigan, and then it goes on. And really, none of the states in this sort of top 10 list are reliable Democratic states. A couple of them are purple states, and the rest of them are red states. And what that means is that there are a lot of Republicans in Congress whose districts have a very concrete stake in these projects, right? These are really big money projects. The new car plants for manufacturing EVs, et cetera, that's like $5 billion investment. Battery plants are cheaper, but they're still in the $1 billion plus range. Same thing for solar. So we're big investments, significant numbers of jobs, not the sort of thing you want to tell you don't want to really go home and tell your constituency, I killed your dream. I've taken away the funding needed for these huge investments in the district. And there's evidence that that's had an effect. On August 7th of last year, 18 House GOP members wrote Speaker Johnson saying that repealing IRA tax credits could undermine growth in the energy sector. The House Freedom Caucus responded angrily and saying, we got to get rid of all that stuff. You people, need to get over your petty parochial interests and get with the plan. But in fact, despite what I'm sure they knew would be adverse reaction of that kind, we have far more than enough House representatives to kill an effort to repeal the IRA entirely if they stick to their guns. And House Speaker Johnson responded by saying, well, you've got to use a scalpel and not a sledgehammer here when dealing with the IRA. So we're going to have to look at what parts of the IRA we want to keep and which ones we don't. Since then, there have actually been a few more House Republicans coming out, sort of joining that group of 18. Now, the negotiations on the Republican reconciliation bill are going to be very complicated, and lots of different people at the table trying to thrash out a compromise. So we don't know what will happen. But at least it's not going to be an easy lift that Republicans can just, lightly agree on to get rid of the IRA. So this is more recent from March, a little more than a couple weeks ago, from the Times. Many members of Congress and business leaders are scrambling to protect projects that are already in the works. Companies plan large investments over long time horizons, and many are counting on the tax credits. Eliminating them overnight would be disruptive and discourage other countries from investing in the United States. They're also trying to sort of tie these investments to the idea of U.S. energy dominance and to the need for, say, the U.S. car industry to remain globally competitive. Regardless of what happens to U.S. policy on EVs, it's clear they're going to be a major and expanding share of the international market. So if we want to be able to export cars, we're going to need to be competitive. So these are the kind of, they're not talking about climate change, certainly, which would be sort of the kiss of death, given that they want to persuade people in the Trump administration and in the Republican caucus. But they are making much more focused, kind of economically based arguments for maintaining the subsidies. The current policymaking situation, I think, could be barely characterized as chaotic. So, as I say, we can't be sure how this is all going to play out. But I think there's at least a very good chance. I think it would be very surprising at this point if there was a complete repeal of the IRA. It would also be very surprising if they didn't touch the IRA, right? So somewhere in between is the likely outcome. And we'll have to wait and see what that looks like. One thing I should also mention is that the Trump administration has been holding funding under the IRA and trying to slow things down. The people who wrote the IRA were actually very clever. What they did was appropriate money over an 8-year period. So if nothing changes in the law, the fact that the Trump people aren't spending the money currently would leave it in the pot for potential funding by a later administration. That's if nothing happens to the law itself, which, as I say, we don't expect that. We expect some changes. I think actually it's more likely that we'll see changes on the direct spending side. And I think the tax credits are probably going to be harder for the Republicans to get rid of, although we could well see some modifications. Okay, so let me say a few words in conclusion. I think we should have plenty of time for Q&A. I think the Inflation Reduction Act is emblematic of green industrial policy, but it didn't come out of nowhere. It built on prior policies, federal, state, and foreign, that have helped build the clean energy sector. We've had tax credits for solar and wind production for a long period of time. What they've tended to be is sort of a short-term law, which then gets renewed. Interesting, those laws, those credits have had support from some surprising quarters, showing, I think, the ability of economics and politics to overwhelm ideology. Um, um, Chuck Grassley from Iowa has been a very influential congressional supporter of wind. You might be wondering why Iowa. Iowa, as it turns out, is a very large producer of wind power, and which it exports, uses quite a fair amount itself, and exports to Illinois and states to the east. So Grassley's been a staunch defender of the industry. Another kind of maybe even more surprising person, somebody who got an award from the Wind Power Association, is Ted Cruz from Texas, right? Texas, too, has invested a ton of money in wind power. It's actually the country's leading producer of wind and has been for quite a while. And so Cruz is, right out there defending the industry. Uh, Obviously not because he could care about climate change, he could care less, but because it's important to Texas. Um, and it'll be interesting to see with solar because Texas has been adding solar faster than anyone else. And although they're still not the top solar state, they are getting there and could well become the top producer of solar power, beating out California. So how will that change the politics? I don't think we can say for sure whether the Biden spending troika or how much of that troika will survive Trump, but they certainly have a better chance at survival than EPA regulations. Or if we had enacted a carbon tax, that would be, dead as a doornail by now. So I think, at least as a comparative matter, we can really be pretty confident in saying that the subsidy approach has given climate policies a much better chance of survival than they would have had under other policy options. And that we've begun to see that building the alternatives to fossil fuels creates political constituencies which can then maintain climate policies in place and encourage investment. The larger point is that climate policy should be about transforming the energy sector. I'm only talking about energy today. That's not everything with climate policy. We've got industrial emissions that are partly chemistry energy related, but also partly chemistry related because of the chemistry of making cement or steel. But in terms of the energy sector, it should be about transforming the sector, not pollution, controlling emissions as an isolated goal. And what we're seeing now from Washington is going to make all of this more difficult. The tariffs on China are going to hurt the clean energy industry because, batteries and a lot of solar stuff is sourced in China. So at least until we can grow more of, continue to grow our US manufacturing capacity for batteries and start producing more rare earth minerals, it's going to be a hit. So we have to deal with that. There are cuts to research funding that will potentially push energy innovation abroad. And we have an ideology that's become, in some quarters, hostile to clean energy just on principle. Somehow it's become tainted as, potentially woke and therefore unacceptable. What I worry about now is that all this is happening here, but in China, they are full speed ahead on clean tech, uh, pouring a lot of money into their industry in the way of subsidies, pushing down prices like crazy, and making clean Chinese technology potentially irresistible, especially in developing countries, right? The Chinese have an electric car that now sells for about $10,000, which is, um, something that's going to be really attractive to people in developing countries, regardless of their concerns about climate change. They're pushing, I mean, I think there are a lot of things to complain about in terms of the reasons the Chinese are doing this, which are, partly, I think, um, efforts to avoid growing internal consumption. And some of the tools the Chinese are doing, you could accuse them of dumping, but the fact remains that they seem to be on a road to dominating this industry. And I do worry the US will be left behind if we don't really take some steps to grow our own clean energy industry. So let's see, speaking of technology, whether I can get out of share screen, and I think we should have plenty of time for questions. Okay, so can you see me now? Are we out of share screen?
Yeah,
Yep,
you can see
perfect.
you. All right.
Okay, great.
All right. Terrific talk, Daniel. So as we do in previous seminars, I'd like to open the floor to students first. So students, I know we have students from different programs participating in this seminar. So first shot to students for asking questions of Daniel. Please unmute yourself and introduce yourself before you ask a question, please. Students.
Hi, my name is Sajjad Al-Shamari. I'm a student in ESE. Thanks for your presentation. It's very nice. Just only I have a question
Sure.
about the carbon capture. We'll see the future for it, or will be stay the same, or will be become like solar and when it's more technology or more things on it.
Yeah, I guess I would distinguish between carbon capture and sequestration for power plants and direct air capture. I think it's clear that we're going to have to develop direct air capture on a major scale by mid-century, even if we are able to reduce our emissions, because we need to pull down some of the CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. I think that will happen. We're already seeing some kind of exciting technological advances. In terms of CCS for power plants, I don't know. I think, I mean, some people just don't like the idea in general and think that even if it would work, even if it were like economically feasible, it would not be the right way to go. Um, I'm pretty broad in what I'm willing to consider doing because I think it's really urgent to reduce our emissions, and I'm reluctant to rule anything off the table. But I'm not sure whether the economics and the sort of logistic issues will be solved, at least in the near future. I, you know, we, you know, the Biden administration was pretty optimistic that in a few years, by the time coal industry would need to implement this stuff, it would be economically feasible. I think some people think that was really overly optimistic. Um, there are also just sort of logistic problems unless you happen to be located in, with your coal-fired power plant sitting over the right geological formations. You're going to have to build a pipeline and ship the CO2 somewhere else and then get it sequestered. And there's building pipelines is a difficult thing, even in some of the states where you might think they want to encourage the use of coal and they'd be in favor of building pipelines. There's been a lot of resistance to the idea of building these CO2 pipelines. So I don't really know. I'm like I said, I don't want to rule it out, especially since we have so many coal-fired power plants across the world. If we could sort of at least get them, through a transition period by using CCS, that might be a good thing. But I'm not sure. It may be that what we really need to do is just go down the road of replacing them with solar wind, geothermal, maybe small modular nuclear, which I'm also open to. But so short answer, I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Students, questions for Dr. Farber? Please raise your hand or unmute yourself and introduce yourself. If you're shy in asking a question, you can drop the question in the chat box. Okay. All right, so I'm going to open up the questions for the general audience. And I want to acknowledge Dr. Sahagian and Dr. Holland, who at Lehigh University are also in the audience. So please, thank you for coming.
Thanks.
Question from Jen. Go ahead.
This is Brina. Hi, thanks. Thanks for your talk, Professor Farber. That was really interesting. And I had just a quick question about sort of strategies. I kind of agree with everything you said about the effectiveness of spending strategies for addressing this problem and to tend to be more stable. And it was great to see all the evidence of that, because I remember at the beginning, I was talking to my students about that when the IRA was first passed, saying, oh, maybe this will work. And so it's nice to see that the sort of the difficulty of undoing some of that is working to some degree. But I wanted to just ask you a little bit more about the regulatory side, because you said you think that the spending strategy will create more stability, be more stable over time. But I wanted to ask you if you could distinguish between two regulatory strategies, which would be passing legislation that has a climate tax in it as not something that's regulating emissions under the Clean Air Act, but actual specific directions to the EPA about implementing a tax that are so carefully constructed that maybe they would survive Supreme Court review, unlike West Virginia EPA versus EPA, the regulations at stake in that one. So do you think that that sort of legislation would be stable enough to kind of give companies the roadmap they need to change behavior?
I think legislation would certainly be more stable than EPA regulation. It's actually not easy to undo EPA regulations. As the Trump people are going to find out, it's a time-consuming, expensive process. But repealing legislation is a much heavier lift. I'm not sure about a carbon tax specifically, because that's been so politically problematic. I think you would need to, they would need to somehow be part of a package where, repealing the carbon tax would start unraveling other things that the public really likes. But I do think, for example, clearer authority to EPA to regulate could be very durable. And if it were well thought out, could be very useful. I think, you could probably get past decisions like West Virginia versus EPA, which overturned Obama's Clean Power Plan, if Congress were to speak more directly. The problem is, of course, that it's very hard to pass these things. The legislation that I just talked about benefited because if you're talking about spending and taxes, there's the reconciliation provision, which lets you get around the filibuster in the Senate. If you're talking, so you could pass a carbon tax through reconciliation, which would be great. On the other hand, you can undo it through reconciliation too. So, sort of easier to pass, also easier to repeal, unless you did something that would kind of provide a bulwark against repeal. If you could get, you would, basically, unless Republicans rethink their stance on climate policy, you would need to have 60 Democratic senators and a Democratic majority in the House, the way you did when Obama was first elected. That would obviously be a very large political shift. It's not an impossible one. We saw it happen before. Um, and I do think if that were to happen, so I do think there's some real possibility there. I'm personally, I like the idea of a carbon tax, but I do, feel like, it's not taxes, anything that looks like a tax, is not an easy sell, and Republicans are very apt to label almost anything a tax, whether or not it is one. So answer is yes, I like the idea of congressional legislation. I think everybody agreed even before Trump that there was a limit to what you could do with EPA regulation anyway, given the existing statutes. You can do some things, but that we really need legislation from Congress to make the kinds of changes that are required by 2040, say, right? We can sort of get through the next 5 to 10 years, but at some point we need new law to make things happen, and I do think that'll be more stable.
Thanks. I love the fee and dividend framing of it also, because I think if we could just get a couple years of something like that working, when people started getting the dividend, that would be the end of it.
Yeah, I think that could be very appealing. Or I could imagine, we're using the carbon tax to save Social Security somehow. I think, I could imagine various ways of making it work. And from my point, unlike economists, I'm mostly attracted to the carbon tax because it's a lot simpler, as opposed to, meeting some ideal of policy, which it may, but I like the fact that it's simple, and relative to, other things. But yeah, got to figure out a way about the politics. Could happen, but certainly, it would take some pretty dramatic political changes to make that work. But we could see sort of bottom-up growth. For example, we now have emissions trading programs, which are, somewhat similar in effect to a carbon tax in California, Washington State, Oregon. New York is, seems to be about to adopt one. You could start seeing those linking together and forming a kind of nucleus of some kind of national program. So I do see some possibilities.
Thanks.
Thank you, Brina. Andrew Ojako, you have your hands raised. Please introduce yourself and unmute yourself first, please.
Okay, thank you, Prof,
Yeah.
for the opportunity. I'm Andrew Jacobo. I'm reaching out from Lagos, Nigeria.
We
Can
can't hear you, Andrew.
Okay.
Yeah, we can't, you're not muted on our end, but we cannot hear you, Andrew.
Hello? Can
It
you
would
hear
be
me?
if Andrew turned off his video. The signal would come through for audio.
Hello?
I can actually do that.
Can I go ahead? Hello?
Yes,
Oh,
please
we
ask
can
your
hear you
question.
now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. My question is, what is the hope of prospective students that are wishing to explore their research interest in renewable energy? Looking at the current US government policy to stop funding research related to renewable energies. What is the hope of prospective students that wish
Right.
to explore their research interest in renewable energy? Me, sir?
So, yes, I can hear you. So I think we're all struggling to understand how the current policies are going to affect, excuse me, are going to affect research
Sorry?
going forward. I think we're struggling to understand how the new policies are going to affect research going forward. And it's a very chaotic situation right now. I think that the administration is probably going to be under a lot of pressure to restore fundings for certain kinds of energy projects where there's a lot of broad energy interest. One of the things they tried to do in the last Trump administration was to get rid of ARPA-E, and they got a lot of resistance to that from Republicans in Congress. So I do think there's going to be some pushback. I think that their initial sort of very broad scale attack may not hold up. I think at least some policy projects, you might need to revamp them and not talk about climate change and talk about energy dominance and stuff. But we don't really know at this point. And I do think it's a terrible dilemma for students, who are in PhD programs or thinking about PhD programs, is like, what's going to happen in this space? There is a real risk that the US is going to lose its technological and scientific edge in this area of research and in biomedical research and elsewhere. I mean, I think these budget cuts that are aimed at research are really very dangerous. That doesn't quite answer your question of what students should do. And I guess the answer is to look for projects where the funding is most likely to continue to have support. So, for example, we know the administration is anticipating a large expansion in demand because of AI. So sort of pitching projects in terms of how do we manage expanded demand with the grid? Could energy storage be an important part of making that happen? Can we improve the way we manage transmission to be able to, more easily feed this expanded demand? I think that's a possibility. I think they're not going to, I think nuclear is something Republicans have really liked, and that's, kind of a safe area. They don't seem to have anything against geothermal. Maybe it just hasn't been on their radar screen, or maybe it somehow, I don't know. So I kind of think, at least in some of these areas, it could be possible to revamp sort of research directions a little bit and still find federal support. But it's a dismaying situation, and puts both people who are already in the PhD or postdoc pipeline in a very insecure situation, and has gone to trouble thinking with people thinking about academic careers. It'll be interesting to see to what extent industry picks up some of the demand. I think that's part of the theory behind some of these. To the extent there's a theory behind the sort of broader scale research cuts, the idea is that more of this stuff should be in the private sector and done by, startups and other energy firms. And I, I think I don't totally agree with the theory, but I think it may be true to some extent that some of this stuff can switch over. We see Bill Gates pushing, his funding in the direction of supporting innovation in the private sector. So bottom line, it's a very concerning situation, but I would not give up on the idea of making a career in this area. It's just too important to the future, and to the future that's developing in the rest of the world, regardless of the US. So I wish I could give you a really, here's what you need to do to be sure that you will be able to pursue your, graduate program and get financial support for your research. And so I can't do that. There's too much uncertainty, but I wouldn't give up either.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you for your response.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dork has his hand up. A question for Dork?
Yeah, boy, that previous was a tough question. We've all been wondering about, of course. And you mentioned that nobody wants to hear about taxes, and certainly that's true. And notoriously, we have been terrible about messaging to the public as a scientific community. I mean, we really are terrible at that. Yet by simply ignoring the impacts of fossil fuel burning, we're essentially imposing a tax on our grandchildren. How might we get that message out more effectively, especially to the districts you mentioned that are all Republican and benefiting from some of these energy transitions?
I do think I agree with you. We have not been good on messaging. I think not only in terms of the benefits to grandchildren, but also, for example, in the pollution, and public health benefits of moving away from coal in particular, and in the sort of potential economic benefits. The Biden people certainly tried to message on the economic benefits of the energy transition, but they don't seem to have been successful, at least on a broad scale. But that may be an easier sell once people started seeing it actually happen, if we get to that point. And yes, I think the sort of intergenerational tax is certainly something that you would hope people. I mean, I think the fear is people can't afford to think that far in the future. They're struggling to make ends meet right now without worrying about that. But I do think it's something we could do a better job. I mean, one of the things I find especially dismaying, and this is not from like conservative sources, just people writing about politics, and they'll say Democrats need to get away from culture war issues like, transsexuality and, um, DEI and climate change. And the idea that climate change could be seen as a culture war issue, uh, you know, it's not. It's science. It's science. How do we communicate that? No, this is not just a bunch of people being woke. This is, yeah. But I do think we need to get out and do it, and find new ways of trying to reach. One of the frustrations is that the people who it's easiest to reach are the people who agree with you in the first place. In our society, and we got to start. I think we need to be creative in ways that I can't really map out about, making better use of social media and the other ways that people actually get their information today.
Any other question from Dork? Okay. Right.
We actually have a question, Rudy,
yeah,
in the chat.
Scott, yeah, Scott, you have your hand raised. Please ask your question, Scott. Scott. Okay, you have a question that in the chat box, so I'll read it out. Tariffs could help. Here's a question from Scott, Danielle. Tariffs could help to discourage dirty production in other countries, to clean up production, more regulated production in the U.S. What do you think? Do you think tariff could force some of these things to happen?
I mean, the current round of tariffs, I think, is unhelpful because, at least in the short run, especially the tariffs on China, um, raise costs for a lot of things in the clean tech industry. And the steel tariffs raise costs for wind power. steel and aluminum. On the other hand, they also raise costs for building out fossil fuel as well. The cost of building a new gas pipeline has just gone up in the last 3 days substantially. Now, in terms of, I'm not sure quite what the question is getting at, but it could be looking at something like the carbon border adjustment that the EU has begun to put in place for certain industries, where basically you have a tariff that's based on the carbon intensity of the import. And I do think that that could potentially provide a real incentive for cleaner production, even in countries that otherwise don't really care about climate policy. But if you need to reduce your carbon footprint to be competitive in the EU market, I think that does have an effect. I think hard to imagine Trump doing this, but I think if the US were to adopt a tariff on that ground, that would also have an effect in China and Korea and other countries that are major exporters to the US. So, yeah, there's at least a tariff-like instrument that I think could potentially be useful. But right now, the trade situation, is in such, I hate to keep repeating the word chaos, because it sounds like I'm overusing it, but I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen to international trade over the next couple of years, and how that could affect almost anything, including energy policy in the US.
Yeah,
Scott,
thank
if I
you. Thanks. I've been under the impression that other nations like China create a lot of pollution, and their products are cheap because they have no regulations, and Americans are incentivized to buy Chinese products because they're cheaper, which creates more pollution.
I think that's been a long time concern. I think it is less true today because the Chinese actually have had a big build out of renewable energy. And although they've also built more coal-fired power plants in the sort of COVID and post-COVID era, it seems pretty clear that Chinese emissions are peaking or going to peak in the near future and start to decline. So I'm not sure how important that edge is in terms of the competitiveness of Chinese products. I think I think labor costs are still cheaper in China than they are here. That's an important factor. And in the clean tech area, the Chinese government has decided that this is an area where they can become a sort of globally dominant exporter, and they're putting a lot of money into trying to make that happen. So I think that the China is bad argument hasn't gone away, but at least currently, China is doing more than we are, or under Trump. So I'm not sure. I think that argument is not as strong as it was, let's say, in the 1990s when the U.S. Just decided to stay out of the Kyoto Agreement because it didn't regulate China.
Any follow-up? So Daniel, I have a question. AI is playing a huge role in every industry, and especially going to play a big role in the energy business. And you have these data centers, they want dedicated plants to be running them, and Amazon and Microsoft are jumping in and actually reviving some nuclear plants. What are some of the legal aspects, if decisions are made, or large decisions are made using AI? Are there some legal issues that would be difficult to overcome?
I think it very much depends on the type of decision. I think, I think, for example, using AI to run the grid or something like that, it's really a question of, what have you demonstrated that it's safe and reliable so that utility regulators, can approve those kinds of changes in the grid. Um, there's been a lot of talk about using AI and sort of the administrative side of things to streamline permitting or, other kinds of administrative actions. There are some real issues there because AI isn't very good at explaining the reasons for what it's doing, and law typically requires an explanation of reasons, not just a decision for many of these things. So I think, let's say EPA can't justify a decision by saying, well, we asked the AI, and the AI said this was the right thing to do. So there's certainly going to be issues there. In the business side, businesses have a lot of discretion about how they do things, but where there are health and safety issues or grid reliability issues or other things for regulators to be concerned about, I think they're going to have to, there's going to have to be some kind of demonstration, as with any new technology, that it's, that's actually going to be safe and effective, basically. The build out of AI is certainly going to be a challenge in terms of cleaning up the grid because it's a big new source of demand, and one way of meeting that demand would be, say, to build out more gas-fired power plants. But as with many things, I think we can expect to see some of it. Maybe we won't see as much because of the developing economic situation. Data centers require a lot of steel to build, apparently. The price of that's going up with tariffs. Uh, uh, gas pipelines, as I was saying, also require a lot of steel. There are components that the fossil fuel industry uses that are, dependent on stuff from China. It's just hard to tell, to what extent the previous projections are going to actually be valid. But I think everybody who works in any aspect of the power system is aware that this is kind of an unanticipated and very large demand shock, and is going to, um, throw off everybody's previous calculations one way or another.
I think that if there's time for one quick question. Oh, thank you, Daniel. This is very interesting. A little different from normally what we have seminar speakers, but we went through some snafus and landed pretty well on our feet. We have the last presentation 2 weeks from now. We'll have Jigar Shah, the former loan guarantee officer in the previous administration. He'll be talking about what does the future look like, and he's got a very positive outlook on what's going to happen in clean energy. So please tune in. That's on April 21st. Thank you all. Thank you, Daniel, for your presentation, and thank you all for attending. We'll see you 2 weeks from now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.